Hello again, 102. In this video, we will continue the influence of the rebellion on other social movements, and we'll talk about Hispanic, Native American, and gay rights. And Hispanic rights and the activism of the student revolts, the civil rights movement, and the crusade for women's rights soon spread to various ethnic minority groups. And the word Hispanic, referring to people who trace their ancestry to Spanish-speaking Latin America or Spain, came into increasing use after 1945 in conjunction with growing efforts to promote economic and social justice. Although frequently used as a synonym for Hispanic, the term Latino technically refers only to people of Latin American descent. Social equality, however, remained elusive for Hispanics who were wanted in the United States for their labor, but not for their culture. After World War II, Hispanic Americans still faced widespread discrimination in hiring, housing, and education. Poverty was rampant. In 1960, for example, the median income of a Mexican American family was only 62% of the national average. And the United Farm Workers will form in 1962 to represent the interests of Mexican American migrant workers. And they will use nonviolent protests, marches, boycotts, and La Huelga, the strike against the California grape growers. And its founder was the charismatic Cesar Chavez, who was born in 1927 in Yuma, Arizona, the son of Mexican immigrants. And Chavez moved with his family to California in 1939. There they joined thousands of other poor migrant farm workers, moving from job to job, living in tents, cars, or ramshackle cabins. After serving in the U.S. Navy during the Second World War, and then working as a migrant laborer, Chavez became a community organizer focused on registering Latinos to vote. And this is cut off a little bit at the bottom. This is Chavez visibly weakened from a 25-day hunger strike in support of the United Farm Workers in March of 1968. And that's Robert Kennedy, who was a great admirer of him at this hunger strike. This is when he stopped the fast. And the United Farm Workers gained national attention in September of 1965 when the union organized the strike La Huelga against the corporate grape growers in California's San Joaquin Valley. As Dolores Huerta explained, we have to get farm workers the same type of benefits, the same type of wages and respect they deserve, because they do the most sacred work of all. They feed our nation every day, and great progress was made by this union in getting better benefits and pay for migrant workers. And Chavez's relentless energy and deep Catholic faith, his insistence upon nonviolent tactics and reliance upon college student volunteers, his skillful alliance with organized labor and religious groups, and the life of poverty that he chose for himself, all combined to attract media interest and popular support. However, the chief strength of the Hispanic rights movement has been the rapid growth of the Hispanic American population. In 1970, Hispanics in the United States numbered 9 million, 4.8% of the total population. By 2000, their numbers had increased to 35 million, 12.5%, and by 2012, they numbered 53 million. Making them the nation's largest minority group at 17%, and they will soon become the majority of the population in the next decade. That's coming. And the voting power of Hispanics and their concentration in states with key electoral votes has helped give the Hispanic point of view significant political clout. Native American rights. American Indians, many of whom began calling themselves Native Americans, also emerged as a political force in the late 1960s. Two conditions combined to give Indian rights a priority. First, many whites felt guilty for the way their ancestors had taken the lands of people who had, after all, been here first. And second, the plight of Native Americans was more desperate than any other group in the country. Indian unemployment was 10 times the national rate. Life expectancy was 20 years lower than the national average, and the suicide rate was 100 times higher than the rate for whites. And red power, activism by militant Native American groups to protest living conditions on Indian reservations through demonstrations, legal action, and at times violence comes about in the 60s. And on November 20th, 1969, 14 Red Power activists occupied Alcatraz Island near San Francisco, which until 1963 had hosted an infamous federal prison. As you'll recall, Al Capone spent time at Alcatraz. Over the next several months, hundreds of others, mostly students, joined the protest, and the Nixon administration responded by cutting off electrical service and telephone lines. Stranded without electrical power and fresh water, most of the protesters left the island. And finally, on June 11, 1971, the government removed the remaining 15 Native Americans from the island. And in 1968, the year before the Alcatraz occupation, two Chippewas, or Ojibwas, living in Minneapolis, George Mitchell and Dennis Banks, founded the American Indian Movement. And in 1973, the American Indian Movement led 200 Sioux in the occupation of the tiny village of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, where the U.S. 7th Cavalry had massacred a Sioux village in 1890. And outraged by light sentences that were given to a group of local whites who had killed a Sioux in 1972, the organizers sought to draw attention to the plight of Indians living on the reservation there, and after the militants took 11 hostages, federal marshals and FBI agents surrounded the encampment. And the standoff at Wounded Knee will go on for weeks. And this drew a great deal of attention. This is cut off at the bottom because this was the symbolic area that ended the Indian Wars of the 19th century. And now it's being occupied again. And it captured more media attention in the first few days than the Indian rights movement had received in the decade up to that point. For 10 weeks, the two sides engaged in a tense standoff, and when AIM leaders tried to bring in food and supplies, a shootout erupted, with one Indian killed and another wounded. Soon thereafter, the confrontation ended with a government promise to re-examine Indian treaty rights, and Indian protesters subsequently discovered a more effective tactic than direct action and sit-ins. They went into federal courts armed with copies of old treaties and demanded that the documents become the basis for financial restitution for the lands taken from them over the centuries. And today, many Native Americans control the gambling rights and the gambling business in many states in the United States. Finally, gay rights. And on Saturday night, June the 28th, 1969, the Stonewall riots were violent clashes between police and gay patrons of New York City's Stonewall Inn was seen as the starting point of the modern gay rights movement. And those riots lasted through the weekend, during which the Stonewall Inn caught fire and burned down. When the turmoil ended, gays had forged a new sense of solidarity embodied in two new organizations, the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance, both of which focused on ending discrimination and harassment against gays and transvestites. And as news of the Stonewall Rebellion spread, the gay rights movement grew in its numbers and its demands. And by 1973, almost 800 gay organizations had emerged across the country. And in every major city, they had a visible gay community and cultural life. That year, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its official manual of mental illnesses. And colleges and universities began offering courses and majors in gay studies. And as was the case with the civil rights and women's movement, however, the campaign for gay rights soon suffered from internal divisions and a conservative counterattack.